What if I told you that one of the most powerful men in music history, a man worth over $160 million, once sat alone on a freezing concrete jail floor, 18 years old, convinced his life was already over? What if I told you that this same man, years later at the absolute peak of his fame, holding mansions and hit records and the adoration of millions, dropped to his knees on a garden lawn and wept like a broken child? Not for the cameras, not for the press, but because he had nearly destroyed the only thing in the world that ever truly mattered. And what if the most shocking truth of all is that it wasn't bullets, wasn't the gang life, wasn't the courtrooms or the murder charges or the toxic empire that nearly finished him? It was his own ego. Before you watch another second of anything today, you need to hear this story in full. Because the real life of Snoop Dogg, the parts they never play on the radio, the parts buried under decades of diamonds and fur coats and comedy shows, is one of the most devastating, most human, and most shocking stories that has ever come out of American music. Stay with me until the very end. You will not see this man the same way again. It begins in the early 1970s in East Side Long Beach, California. Forget the version of California you see in movies, the golden beaches, the Hollywood hills, the gleaming promise of the American dream. East Long Beach in that era was none of that. It was sun-baked concrete and broken glass. It was hollow-eyed men sitting on curbs going nowhere. It was the kind of neighborhood where children learned the sound of a police siren before they learned the alphabet. Into this world, in 1971, a boy named Calvin Cortazar Broadus Jr. was born. And from the very first moment of his life, the odds were already stacked viciously against him. His biological father, Vernell Varnado, was a Vietnam War veteran, a man who came home from war carrying invisible wounds that nobody around him knew how to treat. He walked out of that cramped apartment when Calvin was just 3 months old. 3 months. The boy never knew the warmth of a father's presence. He never heard his father's voice call his name. That door closing behind Vernell Varnado was, in a very real psychological sense, the first wound Calvin ever suffered, and it was one that would bleed quietly for decades. His mother, Beverly Tate, was left alone with an infant and a world that offered her very little. She did everything she could. She worked. She prayed. She held that baby and looked into his eyes, and what she saw there broke her heart open, because what looked back at her was not the carefree gaze of a protected child. It was the wide, bewildered, sorrowful look of something that had already been abandoned. She thought of Snoopy, the famous comic strip dog, the one who always seemed a little lost, a little searching. And so she called her son Snoopy, not as a cute nickname, as a mother's quiet acknowledgement that her child had already been handed a grief he did not deserve. As Calvin grew older, he was, at his core, a good boy. He sang in the choir at Golgotha Trinity Baptist Church every Sunday morning. His voice was high and pure, and it made Beverly cry with joy. She clung to that image. She prayed harder than most people pray for anything that the church walls would hold her son safe. But the 1980s arrived in Long Beach like a plague. The crack epidemic swept through the streets like a slow-moving wildfire, and the neighborhood transformed into something genuinely terrifying. There were no safe places for kids to play. The sidewalks belonged to the gangs. The corners belonged to the dealers. And a fatherless boy wandering those streets would inevitably be found by someone willing to offer him what his father never did, a sense of belonging, protection, and power. The Rollin' 20s Crips found Calvin. Or maybe Calvin found them. Either way, the result was the same. Beverly watched her son's choir robe get replaced by gang colors. She watched his eyes change. She dropped to her knees and begged him. She cried until she had nothing left. But the pull of the streets is something that a mother's love alone cannot overcome when a boy has never been shown what a real family looks like from a father's side. The church hymns were drowned out. The darkness came in. And then came the moment that shattered everything. June 1989. Calvin was supposed to be graduating from Long Beach Polytechnic High School. Instead, at 18 years old, he was arrested for cocaine possession. Beverly's phone rang in the middle of the night. Her son was behind bars. Imagine that call. Imagine being that mother. You sacrificed everything. You prayed without ceasing. You did everything alone. And your phone rings at midnight with that news. Her sobbing in that empty apartment is one of the most quietly devastating sounds in this entire story, even though nobody recorded it and nobody ever will. For Calvin, the inside of that Los Angeles County jail cell was a kind of reckoning. The concrete was cold. The smell was suffocating. The sounds around him were chaotic and frightening. He was 18 years old, and he was staring at the floor of a cell, and for the first time in his young life, the street's false power offered him absolutely nothing. He was alone in the most complete sense of the word. Most people, when they look at Snoop Dogg today, start the story from the fame. They start from Dr. Dre and the Chronic and Doggy Style. They skip over that jail cell. They skip over Beverly weeping. That is a mistake, because everything that Snoop Dogg became, both the greatness and the destruction, grew directly from those roots. What happened next is the part of the story that feels almost too strange to be real, and yet every single detail of it is documented. After cycling in and out of the legal system, Calvin and his cousin Nate Dogg and their friend Warren G formed a group called 213, named after the Long Beach area code. Not as a creative choice, as a statement of identity. As if to say, this city made us, this city broke us, and this city is who we are. They recorded a mixtape in a cramped bedroom. No studio, no equipment budget. Just 3 young men with no real future options pouring every ounce of their pain and their rage and their hunger into a beat. In 1992, at a bachelor party in Los Angeles, Warren G managed to slip that mixtape into the stereo. Dr. Dre, already one of the most powerful figures in American music, was in that room. And when Snoop's voice came through those speakers, something extraordinary happened. The room went quiet. Not because the music was loud, because the voice was different from anything anyone had heard. It was smooth and slow and eerily calm. Not the aggression of the era, but something colder and somehow more dangerous. Dr. Dre stopped everything he was doing. He had to meet this man that night. That meeting launched Snoop Dogg into the stratosphere. He appeared on The Chronic in 1992, and then in 1993 he released Doggy Style, his debut album. No debut album in history had ever done what that record did. It went straight to #1 on the Billboard 200. Instantly. Millions of copies gone from store shelves in days. The money was incomprehensible to a boy who had grown up counting pennies in a crumbling apartment. The mansions, the cars, the clothes, the fame, it all arrived at once, without warning, without preparation. And here is where the story takes a turn that separates Snoop Dogg from so many artists who never make it out of the darkness. Because the fame did not save him. Not yet. Fame is not salvation. Fame is a magnifying glass. It makes everything bigger, including your demons. Death Row Records, the label that launched him, was built like a criminal empire more than a music company. Suge Knight ran it with fear. Artists and employees whispered for decades about what went on inside those halls. The intimidation, the violence that could erupt at any moment over almost nothing. Snoop was at the center of all of it. He was one of the label's biggest stars, but being the biggest star at Death Row was not a comfortable position. It came with constant surveillance, constant threat, constant awareness that something could go wrong at any second. And then August 1993 hit. Right as his career was igniting, right as radio stations across the country were blasting his voice from coast to coast, a night in a Los Angeles park changed everything. A violent altercation erupted. Snoop's bodyguard, McKinley Lee, shot and killed Philip Wooldemariam, a rival gang member. The detail that makes this story so chilling, the detail that turned a local incident into a national crisis, is that Snoop Dogg was sitting behind the wheel of that Jeep when the shots were fired. He was arrested. He was charged. The man who had just debuted the fastest-selling rap album in history was now looking at a potential murder conviction. For 3 years, as the court case dragged forward, he existed in a psychological prison. Not behind bars, but inside his own mind. Every night was nightmares. Every morning was the possibility that this was the day the verdict would come back and take everything. The fear of a life sentence. The fear of the death penalty. 3 years of that. While still performing. While still recording. While still being Snoop Dogg in front of the cameras every single day. He was acquitted in 1996 on the grounds of self-defense. The legal system let him walk. But no verdict can erase what 3 years of that kind of terror does to a human mind. The scar from those years never fully healed. It simply became part of who he was. And then, just months after his acquittal, as if the universe refused to let him rest, Tupac Shakur was assassinated on the streets of Las Vegas. September 1996. Tupac, who was not just a fellow artist but one of Snoop's closest brothers, was shot multiple times while sitting in a car and died 6 days later. This was not a distant tragedy. This was personal. This was someone Snoop had eaten with, created with, laughed with. And now he was gone. In a car. On a street. Exactly the kind of death that Snoop himself had come so close to. The illusion that fame provides protection shattered completely in that moment. Money does not stop bullets. Fame does not stop grief. Snoop had watched his world, the culture he helped build, consume one of its greatest figures. The question that nobody dared ask out loud was obvious. Who was next? The years that followed were a slow recalibration. In 1998, Snoop made a decision that the press called baffling. He left Death Row Records for Master P's No Limit label. The media spun it as a financial or artistic move. But people close to the situation understood something different. Leaving Death Row was survival. It was a man looking at the wreckage around him and making a quiet decision to get out before the fire reached him. It was one of the most important decisions of his life, and he made it with almost no public acknowledgement of how frightened he truly was. He began trying to reinvent himself. Film roles, television appearances. He was trying to build a new version of himself that could exist outside the violence. But the past has a way of collecting its debts regardless of how far you run. In 2011, a stroke took Nate Dogg, his cousin, his original creative partner, one of the last living connections to the very beginning of everything. Nate Dogg had been with him in that cramped bedroom with the broken tape recorder, had helped form 213, had been there when none of it was possible yet. Gone. And the grief of losing him was layered over years of accumulated grief that had never been fully processed. Then 2021, the most devastating blow of all. Beverly Tate, his mother, the woman who had given him his name, who had waited outside prison gates, who had prayed for him in ways he would never fully know, who had loved him through every failure and every betrayal and every dark season, died. In the moment her heart monitor went flat, something inside Snoop Dogg broke in a way that no amount of money or fame or praise could fix. She was the last clean thing from his childhood. She was the proof that someone had always loved him, even when he made himself very difficult to love. And she was gone. Before he could breathe again, in 2024, his biological brother Bing Worthington also passed away without warning. In his 50s, with all the wealth in the world, Snoop Dogg was standing at gravesides wearing black suits, watching his own family be taken from him one by one, utterly powerless. Psychologists have a name for what he was experiencing: survivor's guilt. The relentless, crushing, unanswerable question of why you are still here when the people you loved are not. It is a form of grief that does not announce itself loudly. It lives inside you quietly, and it corrodes everything it touches. But here's where this story turns from tragedy into something almost impossible to believe. Because while all of this was happening, while he was watching his brothers die and his mother die and his entire world slowly empty out, there was a second storm happening entirely behind closed doors. And this one he brought on himself. Go back to 1997, back when Snoop married Shantae Broadus, a woman who had been by his side since high school. Long before the fame. Long before anyone on earth knew who Snoop Dogg was. Shantae had been there. She had waited for him outside jails. She had eaten cheap food with him when record deals were only dreams. She had loved Calvin, not the icon, not the brand, not the persona, just Calvin. They married. They had 3 children together, Cord, Cordell, and their youngest daughter, Corey. And then the fame did what fame does to unprepared men. The tours got longer. The parties got bigger. The women came in numbers that a man from the slums of Long Beach had never imagined possible. Close aides from that era have spoken quietly about the freezing emotional distance that grew between Snoop and Shantae. The mansion was enormous. It was empty. The children had everything money could buy and very little of their father's actual presence. Shantae was disappearing inside a marriage that had become a performance for the public and a silence in private. In 2004, Snoop filed for divorce. He cited irreconcilable differences, the standard legal language that covers up years of specific, accumulated failure. The man who had survived gang initiations and murder charges and a 3-year homicide trial was choosing, with his own hands, to destroy the one relationship that had survived all of it with him. His children were young. His wife was devastated. And he was so deep inside his own ego, so completely intoxicated by Hollywood, that none of it registered as clearly as it should have. Then 2005 arrived. And with it, the single most shocking moment in this entire story. His daughter Corey, 6 years old, a little girl, began showing frightening symptoms. Sudden weight loss, hair falling out, aggressive skin rashes spreading across her fragile body. After exhausting medical testing, doctors delivered a diagnosis that stopped Snoop's entire world cold. Corey had systemic lupus erythematosus, a severe autoimmune disease with no cure. A disease capable of attacking her internal organs at any moment. A disease that could kill her. Sit with that image for a moment. On one side, a man with over $100 million for coats, private jets, multiple mansions, an entourage, and a recording empire. On the other side, his 6-year-old daughter on a white hospital bed, arms pierced with needles, her tiny body being destroyed by an enemy too small to see and too powerful to stop. All of his money, all of his power, all of his fame, and he could not buy one strand of hair to stay on her head. He could not order the disease to stop. He was standing at his daughter's bedside, and he was completely, utterly helpless. That helplessness did something that nothing else in his life had been able to do. It cracked him open completely. Every layer of the Snoop Dogg armor, the cool detachment, the untouchable swag, the ego that had gotten him through 30 years of survival dissolved. What was left underneath was not a superstar. What was left was a father. Just a man named Calvin, terrified of losing his child, suddenly very clear about what he had been throwing away. The divorce papers were torn up. Silently. Without announcement. Without press conference. He was not going to let his children grow up the way he had grown up. Without a father in the house. Without a family whole and intact. The disease that was attacking his daughter became the alarm that woke him from a years-long moral sleep. What followed was one of the most private and profound periods of Snoop Dogg's life. He and Shantae stood together at Corey's hospital bedside. They held her hands together. They prayed together. They wept in ways that celebrities are never supposed to let the public see. And in that sterile, fluorescent-lit room, surrounded by the fear of losing the most precious thing either of them had ever made together, the marriage that had been close to destruction began, slowly, painfully, honestly, to heal. Then came January 12, 2008. For years after those divorce papers had nearly ended everything, Snoop secretly secured the 20-acre estate of R&B legend Charlie Wilson. He told Shantae they were going to an anniversary party for a friend. She dressed up and came along. When she arrived and found 200 of their closest family and friends waiting in the garden, no press, no cameras, no strangers, she was overwhelmed. The sun was setting and the light was gold and soft music was playing, and Snoop Dogg walked forward in an immaculate suit and dropped to one knee in front of his wife. He was not proposing for the first time. He was asking her to renew their vows. He was doing something much harder than a first proposal. He was asking for forgiveness. He was dropping his ego entirely publicly in front of everyone who mattered to him, and he was saying, "I was wrong. I failed you. I failed our children. Please give me the chance to be who I should have been from the beginning." The few people who understood the weight of that moment, who knew what those marriage years had actually cost Shantae, what those years in the streets had done to Calvin, those people understood that what they were watching was not a romantic gesture. It was a reckoning. A man paying a debt with the only currency that actually matters, his full, humbled self. The story does not end there. Because one of the most remarkable parts of Snoop Dogg's transformation is what he did with the guilt he felt about the world he came from and the culture he helped build. In 2005, right in the middle of Corey's illness, right in the middle of his own internal collapse, he used millions of dollars of his own money to establish the Snoop Youth Football League. He personally showed up, not to cut a ribbon and take a photo and leave. He showed up with a whistle and a baseball cap, and he coached. On dusty fields in the poorest neighborhoods of Southern California, working with kids who were living in the exact same environments that had swallowed him up as a boy. The league was placed deliberately in the most dangerous areas, the corners where gangs recruit, the streets where boys without fathers make the same fatal choices Calvin almost made permanently. He gave those kids a jersey, a team, a practice schedule, a reason to show up somewhere other than the corner. And then he showed up too. Adults who were teenagers in those programs are now grown men and women with careers and families and clean records. They will tell you directly. The jersey from Uncle Snoop's league was the reason they chose differently. He was quietly, without spectacle, dismantling the very culture of violence that his early music had celebrated. Not through apology, not through a press release, through actual, daily, consistent work. Today, entering his mid-50s, Snoop Dogg stands at a place in his life that the boy who curled up in that jail cell at 18 could never have imagined. The wealth is real, $160 million and growing. The properties, the cars, the business empire, the cultural influence, all of it is real. But it is the other things that tell the true story. He is a grandfather now. He puts on ridiculous costumes to make his grandchildren laugh. He cooks on television with Martha Stewart with genuine joy on his face. He carried the Olympic torch in Paris in 2024 with a grin so wide it looked like it might break his face open. He is genuinely happy. Not performed happiness. Not camera happiness. The real kind. The earned kind. Look at the men who stood beside him at the height of death row. Tupac Shakur, murdered at 25. The Notorious B.I.G., murdered at 24. Nate Dogg, gone at 41 from a stroke. Eazy-E, gone at 31. These were not peripheral figures. These were the defining voices of an entire era of American music. They are all gone. And Snoop Dogg is still here. Still creating. Still present. Still laughing. Still showing up for his family. That is not luck. That is the result of a series of the hardest possible choices made at the exact right moments. The choice to leave death row. The choice to tear up the divorce papers. The choice to stand at his daughter's hospital bed and let himself break open. The choice to drop to one knee in that garden and admit he had been wrong. The choice to show up on a dusty football field in Compton with a whistle instead of a fur coat. The most profound thing about Snoop Dogg's story is not the rags to riches arc. Plenty of people have that arc. What is extraordinary is that he broke a generational curse with his bare hands. His father left him at 3 months old. The template for what fatherhood looked like in his experience was abandonment. He had every psychological justification in the world to do the same thing. He was in 2004 very close to doing exactly that. And he chose not to. He chose to stay. He chose his children. He chose Shantae. He chose the unglamorous, difficult, humbling work of being present and accountable. His daughter Corey is still fighting lupus. She is now an adult, and she is fighting it with a strength and a public openness that is remarkable. Her father stands beside her. His sons are grown. His family is intact. The house is full. Beverly Tate is gone, and that loss will never stop hurting. But she lived long enough to watch her son become someone she could be proud of. That matters. The final truth of this story is simple, but it costs everything to actually live it. Fame is not an identity. Money is not protection. Power is not love. The only thing that can hold a person together through the worst of what life delivers, the death of brothers, the illness of children, the slow erosion of integrity under the pressure of success, is the decision, made again and again, to choose the people who were there before any of it began. To choose family. To choose humility. To choose to come home. Snoop Dogg's story is not a fairy tale. It is a war report from the inside of a human life. It is the documented evidence that a man can come from the deepest poverty, make the worst possible mistakes, stand at the edge of absolute ruin, and still find his way back. If he is willing to kneel down, let go of his ego, and do the hard and unglamorous work of becoming someone worth the forgiveness he is asking for. That little boy named Snoopy, with the sad eyes and the absent father and the mother crying in the dark, he made it. Not just to wealth and fame. He made it all the way to something rarer and harder. He made it home.